You've heard of Blackbeard, you've heard of Calico Jack, you've probably even heard of Anne Bonny, but I guarantee most of you have never heard of the Barbary Pirates, and that is genuinely criminal, because these guys make the Caribbean pirates look like they were playing pretend. We are talking about a group of North African pirates who operated for over 300 years, enslaved over 1 million Europeans, yes, 1 million with an M, raided as far north as Iceland, and had the most powerful governments in the world literally paying them to stop. Not defeating them, paying them. Britain was paying them. France was paying them. The United States fought their very first overseas war because of them, and that is literally where the Marines got their hymn, "To the Shores of Tripoli." Remember that line? That's these guys. And somehow, despite all of that, barely anyone knows their story. So today, we are going to fix that. This is the real story of the Barbary Pirates, the most successful pirates in history and the most forgotten. Stick around because this one is genuinely insane. Oh, and before we get into it, subscribe and hit the bell, because unlike the million Europeans who never saw it coming, at least you'll know what's headed your way. Let's go. So before we get into the raids and the slaves and the absolute chaos, we need to talk about where all of this came from. Because when most people hear Barbary pirates, they picture a vague North African menace and leave it at that. But there is actually a real, specific, fascinating story behind how this whole enterprise got started. And understanding it makes everything that comes after make a lot more sense. The Barbary Coast, and yes, that is where the word barbarian ultimately traces back to, which is a fun fact for your next dinner party, refers to the coastal regions of North Africa, specifically what is now Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. In the early 16th century, this region was a complicated patchwork of local rulers, Ottoman influence, Spanish ambition, and general political chaos. Spain had just finished driving the Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, history loves a busy year, and in the aftermath, hundreds of thousands of Muslims and Jews were expelled from Spain. Many of them ended up in North Africa, and a significant number of them were very angry, understandably so. You have just been expelled from a country your family has lived in for generations. You have lost your home and your property, and you are now living in a foreign land, looking across the water at the place that did this to you. If someone at that point said, "Hey, want to go raid Spanish coastal towns?" the answer was probably going to be yes. And that is genuinely part of how this started. The earliest Barbary corsairs, and corsair is the proper term, they preferred it to pirate because corsair had a legal and religious legitimacy attached to it that pirate didn't, operated with a kind of motivated fury that went beyond simple economic calculation. This was, for many of them, revenge. Personal, specific, justified in their own minds revenge, which turns out to be an extremely powerful motivator when you are deciding whether to sail a wooden boat into dangerous waters and attack heavily armed merchant vessels. The cities of the Barbary Coast, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, Salé, became the bases from which this enterprise operated, and over the course of the 16th century, they developed into something that was genuinely unique in the history of piracy. Not just pirate ports, but pirate states. Organized, administered, politically sophisticated pirate states that had diplomatic relations with the major powers of Europe and operated with a level of institutional complexity that would have surprised anyone who thought of them as simple sea raiders. Here's something that genuinely surprises most people when they learn about the Barbary Coast. These were not poor, desperate, disorganized criminals operating on the margins of civilization. Algiers in the 16th and 17th centuries was one of the most prosperous cities in the Mediterranean world. It had a population of somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 people, making it larger than most European cities of the same period. It had a functioning government, a legal system, a thriving commercial economy, and active intellectual and cultural life. The corsairs who operated from Algiers were not the bottom of society. They were often its elite. Successful corsair captains were wealthy, respected, politically connected. Their profession was not looked down upon, it was admired. The city of Algiers effectively ran on corsair income. The taxes and fees generated by the corsair enterprise funded the city's infrastructure, its military, its administration. Everyone had a stake in the success of the corsairs: the merchants who provisioned their ships, the craftsmen who built and maintained them, the officials who took their cut of the prizes, the slave traders who handled the human cargo. This was an economy, A sophisticated, well-organized, brutally effective economy built on the capture of human beings and the theft of ships and cargo. And like most economies, it was self-sustaining and self-reinforcing. The more successful the corsairs became, the more investment flowed into the enterprise. The better organized and equipped they became, the more successful they became. By the mid-16th century, Algiers alone had a fleet of between 60 and 70 corsair vessels operating simultaneously. That is not a gang of pirates. That is a navy. The relationship between the Barbary states and the Ottoman Empire is also worth understanding because it shaped everything about how these states operated and why European powers found them so difficult to deal with. The Barbary states were nominally under Ottoman suzerainty. They acknowledged the Sultan as their overlord, paid tribute, and received Ottoman support when they needed it. But in practice, they operated with significant autonomy. The Ottoman Empire was not running the corsair operations from Istanbul. The local rulers of Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli made their own decisions and pursued their own interests. The Ottoman connection gave them diplomatic protection and military backup when things got serious, which made attacking them enormously complicated for anyone thinking about military retaliation. You weren't just fighting pirates, you were potentially picking a fight with the most powerful empire in the world. Now we need to talk about the man who, more than anyone else, was responsible for turning the Barbary coast from a collection of opportunistic raiders into a genuine Mediterranean power. His name was Hayreddin Barbarossa, and if that name sounds familiar, it's because we mentioned him in the Ottoman video as Suleiman's Grand Admiral. But before he was running the Ottoman Navy, he was doing something even more extraordinary, and that story deserves its full attention. Hayreddin was born on the Greek island of Lesbos, probably in the 1470s, the son of a Turkish father and a Greek Christian mother. He had red hair, which is where the Barbarossa nickname comes from. It means red beard in Italian. And he had 4 brothers, all of whom ended up involved in the corsair world. The most relevant one for our story is his older brother, Arouge, who was the one who got the whole enterprise started. Arouge Barbarossa began raiding in the eastern Mediterranean in the late 1900s and early 1500s, and he was good at it, really good. He had a talent for the kind of audacious, fast-moving raids that characterize the best corsair commanders. Hit hard, move fast, don't get caught. He established himself in Tunis, then moved west to Jerba, building his reputation and his fleet with each successful operation. Hayreddin joined him, and the 2 brothers became the most feared corsair partnership in the Mediterranean. Then things got complicated, as they always do. Arouge started getting politically ambitious. He wanted territory, not just plunder. He seized the city of Algiers in 1516, killing its ruler in the process, and declared himself its master. The Spanish, who had their own designs on North Africa and were already present at a fortress just outside Algiers harbor, immediately responded with military force. Arouge was killed fighting the Spanish in 1518, dying on his feet with a sword in his hand rather than surrendering, which was very on brand for him. And this left Hayreddin in charge of a precarious situation. He controlled Algiers, but he didn't have enough military power to hold it against sustained Spanish pressure. He needed a patron, and he knew exactly which patron he needed. Hayreddin sent an embassy to the Ottoman Sultan Selim I in 1919, offering to place Algiers under Ottoman suzerainty in exchange for military support. Selim sent back 2,000 janissaries and the title of governor. It was one of the most consequential diplomatic exchanges in the history of the Mediterranean, because what it meant was that Algiers, and by extension the entire Barbary corsair enterprise, now had Ottoman backing. Any European power that wanted to seriously challenge the corsairs now had to factor in the possibility of Ottoman retaliation, and nobody wanted that fight. With Ottoman support secured, Hayreddin spent the next 2 decades doing something that was genuinely brilliant. He didn't just raid, he built. He organized the city of Algiers into a functioning administrative state. He improved the harbor defenses. He developed the slave market and ransom system into efficient commercial enterprises. He recruited constantly, not just from the Muslim world, but from anywhere he could find capable men, including, significantly, Europeans who were willing to convert to Islam and join the corsair enterprise. These European converts, who we will talk about in detail later, turned out to be enormously valuable. Many of them brought skills and knowledge about European shipping routes, European naval tactics, and European coastal geography that made the Corsair raids dramatically more effective. By the time Suleiman the Magnificent called Hayreddin to Istanbul in 1533 to take command of the entire Ottoman navy, Hayreddin had built Algiers into the most powerful Corsair base in the Mediterranean. The man who showed up at the Ottoman court was not a pirate captain. He was a statesman, an admiral, an administrator, and arguably the most knowledgeable naval mind in the Mediterranean world. He went on to win the Battle of Preveza in 1538, which, as we discussed in the Ottoman video, was one of the most decisive naval victories of the 16th century. He died in Istanbul in 1546, in his own bed, at a ripe old age, enormously wealthy and respected. Not bad for a kid from Lesbos. The Corsair empire he built at Algiers outlasted him by nearly 300 years. That is his actual legacy. Not just his own career, but the institution he created that would terrorize European coasts for centuries after his death. All right, so you understand the context now. You know where this came from and who built it. Let's talk about the actual mechanics of how this whole operation worked, because it is genuinely fascinating and it is way more organized than you are probably imagining. The Corsair enterprise was not a bunch of men and boats going out and hoping for the best. It was a sophisticated commercial operation with investors, legal frameworks, profit-sharing arrangements, and supply chains. Starting from the beginning, a Corsair expedition required a ship, a crew, weapons, provisions, and crucially, capital. The ship had to be fitted out, the crew had to be recruited and provisioned, and all of this cost money before a single prize had been taken. So, Corsair expeditions were funded like commercial ventures. Investors, wealthy merchants, ship owners, government officials would put up the capital for an expedition in exchange for a share of the profits. The captain would take his share, the crew would take their shares divided according to rank and skill, the investors would take their portion, and the government of whichever Barbary city the expedition was operating from would take its cut in taxes and fees. This is not meaningfully different from how legitimate merchant voyages were financed in the same period. Same basic structure, slightly different cargo. The ships themselves varied enormously over the 3 centuries of Barbary Corsair activity. In the early period, the Corsairs relied primarily on galleys, long, low vessels powered by oars and supplemented by sails. Galleys were fast in calm conditions and could operate in shallow coastal waters where larger sailing ships couldn't follow. They were perfect for the hit-and-run raids on coastal towns that characterized the early Corsair period. The downside was that galleys required enormous numbers of rowers, typically slaves, which created a circular dependency. You need slaves to row the ships that you use to capture slaves. As the 17th century progressed, the Corsairs increasingly shifted to sailing ships. This was partly because European sailing technology had improved to the point where sailing ships could outrun galleys in most conditions, making the galley less viable as a raiding vessel. The shift to sailing ships dramatically extended the Corsairs' operational range. Suddenly, they could operate not just in the Mediterranean, but in the Atlantic as well, which is how you end up with Corsairs raiding the coasts of Ireland and Iceland. Geography that would have been completely inaccessible to a galley fleet was suddenly within reach of a well-provisioned sailing vessel. The actual raiding operation had several distinct forms, and the Corsairs used all of them depending on circumstances. The most dramatic, and the one that produced the largest hauls of captives, was the land raid. This is what happened at Baltimore in Ireland and in dozens of other coastal communities across Europe. A Corsair fleet would approach the coast at night using local intelligence about the layout of the target settlement and the size and quality of its defenses. They would land before dawn, move quickly through the settlement, take everyone they could find, and be back on their ships and at sea before an effective response could be organized. Speed was everything. The whole operation would typically take 2 to 3 hours. The success of a land raid depended enormously on intelligence. The Corsairs were surprisingly good at gathering it. They had agents, sometimes local converts, sometimes merchants who traded in the Mediterranean, sometimes captives who had been released and paid for information, who could tell them which villages were poorly defended, which coastal roads led where the local militia kept their weapons, which nights the fishing fleets were out, leaving communities with fewer men. When the intelligence was good, the raids were devastatingly effective. The second form was the sea raid, intercepting merchant vessels on the major trade routes of the Mediterranean and Atlantic. This was actually the more economically significant operation for most of the Corsair period, because cargo carried people as well as cargo, and cargo was pure profit without the complications of housing, feeding, and ransoming human captives. A well-laden merchant vessel could be worth a fortune in silk or spice or silver that could be sold immediately at market. The captains and crew of captured merchant ships were a bonus, valuable for ransom or for service on Corsair vessels if they had useful skills. The third form, less dramatic but perhaps most consequential over the long run, was simply the economic disruption that the mere existence of the Corsair threat caused. European merchants had to pay for armed escorts. Insurance rates on Mediterranean voyages were astronomical. Entire coastal regions were effectively depopulated as communities moved inland away from the threat. The economic cost of the Barbary Corsairs to European commerce was, over 3 centuries, genuinely staggering, probably far exceeding the direct value of everything they actually captured.
Right, let's talk about what actually happened to the people who were captured, because this is the part of the story that tends to get glossed over in popular accounts, the human reality of what the Corsair enterprise meant for the people caught up in it. And I want to be clear going in that this is not a comfortable part of the story, but it is an important one, and we are going to go through it properly. When a Corsair ship returned to Algiers or Tunis or Tripoli with captives, those captives were taken to the slave market. The main slave market in Algiers was in the central city, open and public, operating on regular market days. Captives were displayed for buyers to inspect, their health, their teeth, their apparent strength, all being factors that determined their price. This is deeply unpleasant to describe, and it was deeply unpleasant to experience. European accounts of people who went through it and survived describe the humiliation and terror of being examined like livestock in front of crowds of buyers. Now here is where it gets complicated and nuanced, because the reality of slavery in the Barbary states was not a single uniform experience. There was an enormous range of what captivity could mean, depending on who you were, what skills you had, whether your government would ransom you, and a considerable amount of simple luck. At the worst end of the spectrum were the galley slaves. Men who ended up chained to an oar on a Corsair galley were in genuine hell. The physical conditions of galley slavery were brutal: constant physical exertion, inadequate food, exposure to the elements, regular beatings for poor performance, the ever-present smell of the sea and the bilge and the men chained beside you. Survival rates were poor. Freedom was essentially impossible while the ship was at sea. If you ended up as a galley slave and you had no family with money or no government willing to pay for your release, your life expectancy was not great. The next tier down, which was actually much more common for the majority of captives, was domestic slavery and labor in the city. Men and women captured in raids frequently ended up as household servants or craftsmen working for private owners in Algiers or Tunis. The conditions here varied enormously depending on the owner. Some were treated relatively well. Some were treated brutally. Most fell somewhere in between. There was also a category of captive that occupied a peculiar middle position in Barbary society, the skilled specialist. If you were a captive with a skill that was valuable and not easily replaced, a ship's carpenter, a navigator, a doctor, an engineer, a master craftsman, your situation was considerably better than the average captive. The Barbary states genuinely needed European technical skills in certain areas, particularly in navigation and shipbuilding. A European navigator who understood Atlantic sailing patterns was worth far more in service than in a chain. These men frequently negotiated arrangements that were closer to employment than slavery, working in their profession, receiving some pay, moving relatively freely in the city, with the theoretical understanding that they would be released or ransomed eventually. The government slaves, men who ended up in the possession of the ruling authority rather than private owners, had their own distinct experience. In Algiers, the government owned the largest single block of slaves, housed in facilities called bagnios, essentially slave barracks, large communal housing facilities. The bagnios were rough and overcrowded, but they also had a surprising degree of internal social organization. Captives ran their own taverns inside the bagnios. Yes, really, there were bars inside the slave quarters. organized their own religious services, maintained their own hierarchies. European priests were present in some bagnios, operating with the tacit permission of the authorities. The bagnio at Algiers was described by multiple captives as a kind of terrible city within a city. 2,000 to 3,000 men of every European nationality crammed together, creating their own community in the worst of circumstances. And through all of this ran the constant thread of ransom. The possibility for most captives that eventually, somehow, someone was going to pay for their release. And that possibility, however distant it seemed on a bad day, was what kept people going. Because the alternative was accepting that this was permanent, and most people were not willing to do that.
Now, here is the part of the story that most people have never heard of and that I find absolutely fascinating. Among the tens of thousands of Europeans captured by the Barbary corsairs over 3 centuries, a significant proportion of them, estimates range from 10 to 20%, which is a lot of people, converted to Islam and stayed voluntarily. Some of them under varying degrees of pressure, yes, but many of them genuinely, freely, and by their own account, happily choosing to leave their old life behind and start a new one in North Africa. These men were called renegades by their contemporaries, and the word was not complimentary. To a 17th century European, becoming a renegade was one of the worst things a person could do. You were abandoning your religion, your country, your culture, your family, everything that defined you. The Catholic Church considered it a form of spiritual death. Your government considered it treason. Your family considered it a disgrace. And yet, thousands of men did it. Why? Well, for a start, the alternative was often not great. If you were a poor sailor captured from a merchant vessel and you had no family with money and no government willing to ransom you, your options were galley slave or domestic slave with no clear path to freedom. Converting to Islam, the act the corsairs called turning Turk, immediately changed your status. You were no longer a slave. You were a free man in a Muslim society. You could own property, practice a trade, marry, have children. Your old life was gone, but your new life was actually livable in a way that continued captivity was not. For men at the bottom of the social ladder who had nothing to go back to, even if they could, this was not a difficult calculation. But the renegades were not only men with nothing to lose. Among them were men of considerable skill and ambition who looked at the Barbary corsair world and saw opportunity rather than captivity. And those men are the ones who really shaped the story. Because here is the thing about the renegades that made them so valuable to the corsair enterprise. They knew things. A Dutch navigator who converted and joined the corsairs brought with him detailed knowledge of Dutch merchant shipping routes, Dutch coastal geography, the schedules of Dutch trading fleets, the defensive capabilities of Dutch ports. That knowledge was worth a fortune. Multiply that across English renegades and French renegades and Italian renegades and Spanish renegades, and you have an intelligence picture of European maritime commerce that no North African could have assembled on his own. The corsairs understood this, and they actively recruited among their captives for men with useful skills and an appetite for a different life. The most successful renegades rose to extraordinary positions. Some became corsair captains themselves, commanding fleets and conducting raids against the same European coasts they had grown up on. Some became senior officials in the Barbary state governments. Some accumulated enormous wealth and built the palatial houses that still stand in the medinas of Algiers and Tunis. There was an Englishman from Exeter named John Ward, who became one of the most feared corsair commanders of the early 17th century, operating from Tunis and reportedly worth a fortune. He was so notorious in England that plays were written about him, news pamphlets described his outrages in lurid detail, and the King of England offered enormous rewards for his capture. Ward lived in Tunis in a house that visiting Europeans described as palatial, ate magnificently, dressed magnificently, and apparently died magnificently, in his own bed, of the plague, having successfully avoided capture and execution for over 2 decades. Not bad for a fisherman from Faversham, Kent. There was a Dutch captain named Jan Janssen who took the name Murad Reis after converting, who was operating from the Moroccan port of Salé and who led the famous raid on Baltimore, Ireland in 1631 that we mentioned in the hook. The man who took 107 Irish villagers and sold them into slavery in North Africa was Dutch. History is complicated. The renegades are one of the clearest examples of how completely the Barbary corsair world defied the simple narratives of Christian Europe versus Muslim Africa that contemporaries tried to impose on it. The reality was messier, more human, and considerably more interesting than the story anybody was telling at the time. Alright, let's get into the actual operations, because we have been building context for a while now, and it is time to talk about what these people actually did and how they did it. And some of these raids are so audacious, so far outside of what anyone expected pirates to be capable of, that they read like fiction. Starting with the one that most people cite as the most shocking geographically, the Iceland raids. In 1627, a fleet of corsair ships from Salé and Algiers, and this fleet included renegades who knew Atlantic navigation, sailed north past the British Isles, past the Faroe Islands, and arrived at Iceland. Iceland. At the time, Iceland was a Danish territory, extremely remote by the standards of the day, a place that had essentially never been involved in Mediterranean affairs and had absolutely no reason to expect corsair ships to appear off its coast. The corsairs raided multiple locations around the Icelandic coast over the course of several weeks. They took somewhere between 400 and 900 Icelanders, the sources disagree on the exact number, and sailed south with them to Algiers. The impact on the small Icelandic communities affected was devastating. The raids are still remembered in Iceland today. There is a substantial body of Icelandic literature, poems, accounts, lamentations, dealing with the trauma of the Turkish raid, as it is known in Iceland. Some of the Icelandic captives were ransomed back after years of lobbying by the Danish crown. Most were not. Iceland was not an isolated incident. It was the most dramatic example of a pattern of Atlantic raiding that the corsairs had developed as they shifted from galleys to sailing ships in the early 17th century. They raided the coasts of Ireland repeatedly. They raided Cornwall in England. They raided the coasts of Spain and Portugal and France. They operated in the waters of the English Channel. There are records of corsair ships captured in the Thames estuary, the river leading to London. Let me repeat that. Barbary corsairs were operating in the Thames estuary. That is not distant North Africa piracy. That is your problem now. The Baltimore raid of 1631 is the most famous of the Irish raids and deserves its full story. Baltimore was a small fishing village on the southwest coast of Ireland, remote, quiet, largely dependent on the pilchard fishing trade. On the night of June 20th, the corsair fleet under Jan Johnson arrived off the coast, having received intelligence about the village from a local fisherman. There is some historical debate about whether this was willing collaboration or coercion, but either way, someone local provided the information that made the raid possible. The fleet landed before dawn. The corsairs moved through the village in two columns, one taking the English settler community on the main street and one taking the Irish fishing families in the lower part of the village. The whole operation lasted about 2 hours. 107 people were taken. 2 men who fought back were killed. The rest of the village fled into the surrounding countryside and survived. Of the 107 captives, 2 were ransomed and returned to Ireland. The rest spent the remainder of their lives in North Africa. One woman, Joan Broadbrook, wrote a letter back to Ireland from Algiers. It is one of the few first-person accounts we have of a Barbary captive's early experience. She described the terror of the voyage, the slave market, the uncertainty of what would happen next. Then the letters stopped, and we don't know what became of her. The Baltimore raid had a profound effect on the Irish coastal communities. Several villages along the southwest coast were completely abandoned in the years following the raid. People simply moved inland rather than risk staying near the sea. The economic and social impact on the region lasted for generations. And then there were the raids on the Cornish coast of England. The town of Penzance was raided in 1625. Villages near Looe were attacked. Hundreds of Cornish fishermen and coastal dwellers were taken over the course of several years. The English Parliament debated the corsair threat. Petitions poured in from coastal communities demanding naval protection, and the English government, which was simultaneously dealing with an expensive war with Spain and a constitutional crisis with Parliament, largely failed to provide it. Which brings us to the question everyone always asks when they learn about all of this. Why didn't anyone stop them? This is genuinely one of the most interesting questions in the whole story, because the honest answer is complicated and slightly embarrassing for the European powers involved. The short version is they tried, they mostly failed, and the reasons they failed say something revealing about both the nature of the corsair enterprise and the limitations of European state power in the 17th century. Let's start with the military problem. The Barbary corsairs were extraordinarily difficult to fight on their own terms. Their whole operational strategy was built around speed and evasion. A corsair fleet that was in danger of being caught by a superior force simply scattered.
Individual ships ran for shallow waters, for the complex coastlines of North Africa where European warships couldn't follow, for friendly ports where they could take shelter. The corsairs never had to stand and fight if they didn't want to, and they were smart enough not to want to most of the time. The one approach that reliably worked against them was blockading their home ports, keeping them penned in Algiers or Tunis so they couldn't get out. European navies attempted this multiple times. It worked, temporarily, but maintaining a blockade is enormously expensive and requires a sustained commitment of naval resources over months and years. Every time European powers tried it, they eventually ran out of money or political will or both and withdrew. And the moment the blockade lifted, the corsairs were out again. The geography of North Africa also worked massively in the corsairs' favor. Their home ports were at the end of long supply lines from Europe. European naval expeditions had to cross the Mediterranean first, and operating at a distance from your own supply base while the enemy is operating on their home ground is a serious strategic disadvantage. The corsairs knew every reef and sandbar and shallow water along their own coast. European commanders were operating with incomplete charts in unfamiliar waters. Then there's the political problem, which was honestly just as significant as the military one. The European powers were almost never able to cooperate against the corsairs for long enough to make a real difference. England and France and Spain and Venice and the Dutch Republic all had corsair problems. They also all had problems with each other. France in particular had a deeply complicated relationship with the Barbary states because France had an alliance with the Ottoman Empire, one of the more eyebrow-raising diplomatic arrangements of the 16th century, a Catholic monarchy allied with an Islamic empire against their shared enemy, the Habsburgs, and that alliance created reluctance to take strong action against Ottoman protectorates in North Africa. It is very difficult to project unified military force against an enemy when one of your potential coalition partners has a separate deal with that enemy's patron. And then there is the most uncomfortable political reality of all. Some European powers were not entirely opposed to the corsairs' activities when those activities were directed at their rivals. English corsairs raided Spanish shipping. Spanish authorities were not heartbroken when French merchant ships were taken. The corsairs' victims were not always your own citizens, and sometimes they were someone you didn't like much anyway. This kind of calculation, not my problem, or actually somewhat convenient, made sustained coalition action against the corsairs essentially impossible. The corsairs understood this perfectly, and they were very good at playing European powers against each other. Algiers at various points had treaties with England, France, the Dutch Republic, and other powers that essentially guaranteed the safety of that power's shipping in exchange for trade concessions and political recognition. Getting a treaty with Algiers was a practical necessity for any European maritime power, because the alternative, having your ships and citizens taken without the possibility of official negotiation for their return, was worse than the humiliation of signing an agreement with people you technically considered pirates. So you had this bizarre situation where European governments were simultaneously publicly denouncing the Barbary corsairs as criminals and barbarians, while privately negotiating treaties with them and paying them tribute. And the corsairs took the tribute and the treaties with one hand and continued raiding with the other, because the treaties were always full of ambiguities that could be exploited. It was diplomacy as a protection racket, and the corsairs were very good at it. One of the most surprising aspects of the Barbary corsair world, and there are a lot of surprising aspects, we have established that, is how developed and sophisticated the system for ransoming captives became. Because here's the thing. The corsairs did not necessarily want to keep all their captives permanently. A slave you keep costs you money, food, housing, supervision. A slave you ransom generates a one-time payment that can be quite large. The economic incentives actually favored releasing captives if the price was right, which meant there was a genuine market for human release as well as human capture. And where there's a market, entrepreneurs appear. The ransom industry that developed around Barbary captivity was extraordinary in its scale and complexity. At the institutional end, there were religious orders specifically dedicated to ransoming Christian captives from North Africa. The Trinitarians, founded in the 12th century, and the Mercedarians, founded in the 13th, both had ransoming captives as a core part of their mission. These orders collected donations across Catholic Europe, traveled to Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli with money, and negotiated the release of as many captives as they could afford. They published accounts of their redemption missions, illustrated pamphlets showing the captives being freed that served as both propaganda and fundraising materials. Very early examples of what we would now call a charity marketing campaign. The orders operated within a recognized legal and commercial framework in the Barbary states. They had agents in Algiers who kept lists of captive Christians, tracked their conditions and locations, and communicated with families in Europe about the possibility of ransom. This was not clandestine, it was an acknowledged part of how the system worked. The Barbary rulers allowed it because ransoming was good business, and they had no interest in disrupting a revenue stream. At the private end of the market, individual families who had the means would negotiate their own ransoms. This required finding an intermediary, typically a North African Jewish merchant who had the commercial networks and the trust of both sides to act as a broker, agreeing on a price, arranging the transfer of funds, and hoping that the captive would actually be released when the money arrived. The process could take years. The prices varied enormously depending on who you were and who the corsairs thought your family could be persuaded to pay. An ordinary fisherman with a poor family might be ransomed for a modest sum, or might not be ransomed at all if nobody could raise the money. A wealthy merchant or a nobleman or a ship's captain with rich relatives and a government willing to apply diplomatic pressure could be ransomed for a fortune. There are cases of captives being held for 10, 15, 20 years while their families struggled to raise the ransom. There are cases of families selling everything they owned, houses, land, livestock, tools, to pay for a father's or brother's release. There are cases of people going back into captivity voluntarily as a guarantee while their ransom was being arranged, an act of trust in the system that is genuinely remarkable when you think about it. The economics of ransom also created some perverse incentives that the corsairs exploited with considerable creativity. If they knew that a captive's family was wealthy and motivated, they could drag out the negotiation, adjusting the price upward as the family's desperation increased. There are documented cases of the ransom price being raised multiple times over the course of negotiations, as the corsair negotiators tested how much the family would pay. The family, having already committed emotionally and financially to the process, was usually too deep to walk away. At the governmental level, ransom became essentially a foreign policy issue. Governments regularly allocated treasury funds to ransom their citizens in bulk, large redemption missions that might free hundreds of captives at once. England did this, France did this, Spain did this. The United States would eventually do this too, as we will get to. The total amount of money that flowed from Europe to North Africa in ransom payments over 3 centuries is impossible to calculate precisely, but it was certainly enormous, and every payment reinforced the system, demonstrating that captivity was profitable for the corsairs and that the European powers lacked the capability or will to simply stop it by force.
We are unusually well informed about the experience of Barbary captivity compared to many historical subjects, and that is because a remarkable number of European captives who were eventually released wrote about their experiences. Some wrote memoirs, some wrote letters, some gave testimony to courts or church authorities after their return. Some had their stories written up by others who interviewed them. The result is a body of first-person and near-first-person accounts of Barbary captivity that gives us a genuinely vivid picture of what it was actually like. And the picture is, predictably, complicated. It is not uniformly horrific, though it certainly could be. It is not strangely comfortable, though there were people who found it more bearable than you might expect. It is, above all, deeply human. People adapting, negotiating, surviving, and occasionally flourishing in circumstances that none of them chose. One of the most famous accounts is by Miguel de Cervantes. Yes, the man who wrote Don Quixote. Cervantes was captured by Barbary corsairs in 1575 while sailing from Naples to Spain and was held in Algiers for 5 years before being ransomed. He attempted to escape 4 times. All 4 attempts failed. His account of his captivity, scattered through his later writings rather than in a single memoir, is one of the most detailed and literary records we have of what Algiers was like in the late 16th century. Cervantes described the bagnio where he was held, the daily rhythms of captive life, the complex social world that developed among the captives, the presence of European merchants and priests who moved relatively freely in the city, the constant negotiations and schemes and hopes surrounding the possibility of ransom. He also described the brutality, the punishments, the galley service, the casual cruelty of individual owners. His 5 years in Algiers clearly marked him deeply, and his writing shows it.
There's a remarkable passage in Don Quixote, the captive's tale, that is widely understood to draw on his own experience, and it remains one of the most vivid fictional reconstructions of Barbary captivity ever written. Beyond Cervantes, there are dozens of other accounts that between them build a remarkably detailed picture. Thomas Phelps, an English sailor, was captured in 1684 and held for 2 years before escaping. His account, published in London in 1685, was a bestseller by the standards of the day. The 17th century reading public was fascinated by Barbary captivity narratives, much like later readers would be fascinated by accounts of travel to exotic places. His descriptions of Algiers are detailed and specific: the markets, the architecture, the social hierarchy among the captives, the relationships between captives and their owners. Francis Knight, another English captive, was held for 7 years in Algiers in the early 16th century and wrote an account that is valuable precisely because it refuses to simplify. He describes corsairs who treated him with genuine kindness, alongside corsairs who were brutal. He describes fellow captives who maintained their dignity and identity throughout their captivity, alongside others who converted and chose to stay. He describes his own psychological journey, the despair of the early months, the gradual adaptation, the complicated feelings about his eventual release. What emerges from all these accounts is a picture of a society that was neither the paradise its inhabitants claimed nor the hell that European propaganda depicted. It was a functioning city with its own rules and values and social hierarchies, in which European captives occupied a specific, defined, uncomfortable but not always intolerable position. The captives had agency, limited, constrained, precarious agency, but agency nonetheless. They could negotiate, they could form relationships, they could sometimes improve their conditions through skill or personality or connection. What they could not do, most of them, was leave. And that inability, that fundamental denial of freedom, is the thread that runs through every account, regardless of how otherwise varied their experiences were. You could adapt to almost everything else. You could not adapt to not being free.
Now here is the part of the story where it suddenly becomes very relevant to American history, which is always fun because most Americans have no idea their country's early foreign policy was shaped almost entirely by North African pirates. Let's set the scene. Before American independence in 1776, American merchant ships operating in the Mediterranean were protected by British treaties with the Barbary states. Britain had negotiated arrangements, part diplomatic, part tribute, that kept Barbary corsairs away from British-flagged vessels. American ships were covered under those arrangements as long as they were technically British ships, which is to say as long as they were colonial ships. The moment America became an independent country with its own flag, that protection evaporated. American ships in the Mediterranean were suddenly stateless in the eyes of the Barbary states, unprotected by any treaty, unrecognized by any arrangement. Fair game. And the corsairs took immediate advantage. In 1785, just 2 years after American independence was formally recognized, Algerian corsairs captured 2 American merchant ships, the Maria and the Delphine, and took their crews captive. This was the beginning of a problem that would consume enormous amounts of American diplomatic and financial energy for the next 3 decades. The new American government, operating under the Articles of Confederation, had essentially no navy and essentially no money. Paying ransom for the captured sailors was difficult enough. Doing anything more substantive about the underlying problem was essentially beyond their capacity. Thomas Jefferson, who was serving as American minister to France at the time, argued for a military response. John Adams, serving as minister to Britain, argued for paying tribute like everyone else did. They actually met together with the ambassador from Tripoli in London in 1786 to try to negotiate. Jefferson asked the ambassador, with genuine curiosity apparently, not as a rhetorical trick, by what right the Barbary states attacked ships from countries that had done nothing to harm them. The ambassador's response, which Jefferson reported to Congress, was essentially, "It is our religion. Our right is founded on the laws of the Prophet. We are ordered to make war on non-believers, and we will always be at war with you unless you pay us to stop." Jefferson found this answer unsatisfying. The American response for the next decade was, broadly speaking, Adams's approach: pay. The United States signed treaties with Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, paid substantial tribute, and ransomed the captured sailors for a considerable sum. The treaty with Algiers in 1995 cost the United States approximately $1 million, roughly 1/6 of the entire federal budget at the time. This was genuinely painful and politically controversial. The idea that the new American Republic, founded on the principle of freedom from tyranny, was paying tribute to North African potentates was deeply uncomfortable for many Americans. But the alternative, building a navy capable of forcing the issue, seemed even more expensive and uncertain. When Jefferson became president in 2001, he came to office having spent 15 years arguing that the tributary approach was wrong and a naval approach was right. And almost immediately he got the opportunity to act on that position, because the Pasha of Tripoli, Yusuf Karamanli, demanded a larger tribute payment, and when Jefferson refused, declared war on the United States by having the flagpole in front of the American consulate chopped down. This was actually the formal declaration of war by Tripolitan standards. Jefferson sent a naval squadron to the Mediterranean, the first American military force sent overseas, and the First Barbary War began. It lasted from 1801 to 1805, and it was, broadly speaking, a qualified American success. The American Navy blockaded Tripoli, engaged Tripolitan naval forces, and conducted a famous overland expedition led by a former Army officer named William Eaton, who marched a force of 8 Marines and a collection of mercenaries from Alexandria in Egypt across the Libyan desert to attack Tripoli from the land side. The operation was audacious and partially successful. They captured the city of Derna, the first time the American flag was raised over a fort in the Old World, and that is where the Marine Corps hymn line comes from, "To the shores of Tripoli." Real place, real operation. A second Barbary War followed in 1815 and was even more decisive. Commodore Stephen Decatur took a naval squadron to the Mediterranean and forced favorable peace terms from Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli in quick succession. The American approach, actually fighting rather than paying, worked, but the broader Barbary problem would not be definitively solved by American naval action.
We have covered the big picture thoroughly. Let's take a break from the macro history and talk about some of the individual stories that make the Barbary Corsair world one of the most extraordinary subjects in history. Because when you get into the specific lives of specific people caught up in this enterprise, the Corsairs, the captives, the renegades, the ransomers, you encounter stories that you could not invent. Starting with arguably the most extraordinary individual in the entire story, who is not Hayreddin Barbarossa, a man named Morad Reis the Elder. Not to be confused with Jan Jansun, who also took the name Morad Reis, because apparently it was a popular name for Dutch corsairs who converted to Islam. This Morad Reis was a Flemish man born around 1534 who was captured by corsairs, converted, and rose through the ranks of the Algerian corsair world to become one of its most senior commanders. What makes his story extraordinary is not his military career, impressive as it was, but what happened at the end of it. In his old age, Morad Reis retired to a comfortable life in Algiers, enormously wealthy, highly respected, a pillar of the community that had taken him from Flanders as a young man. At some point in his later years, his son, who had been raised in Flanders and knew nothing about the father who had disappeared when he was small, tracked him down. The son traveled to Algiers specifically to find him, and found him, living in a palace with a new family, completely integrated into North African Muslim society. The reunion, by all accounts, did not go well. The son wanted his father to come home and repent. The father had no interest in either. He was home. This story gets at something genuinely profound about the Barbary Corsair world that is easy to miss when you are focused on the raids and the slave markets. For many people who ended up there, it became their world. Not just a prison they endured, but a place they inhabited fully, with all the attachments and loyalties and identities that implies. Then there is the story of Father Pierre Don, a Trinitarian friar who made multiple trips to Algiers in the early 16th century to ransom captives and wrote one of the most detailed contemporary accounts of the city we have. Father Don was a careful, methodical observer who genuinely tried to understand the society he was moving through rather than simply denouncing it. His account describes Algiers with a specificity and a relative fairness that makes it invaluable historically. He describes the markets, the government, the social hierarchy, the treatment of captives, the good and the bad. He describes the renegades with something closer to sympathy than condemnation, recognizing that for many of them, the choice to convert was not a simple act of cowardice or greed, but a response to circumstances that left them few other options. His ransoming missions released hundreds of captives over the course of his career. He is one of the genuinely admirable figures in this whole messy story. And then there is the story that I think about more than any other in this entire subject. A young Irish woman named Ellen Nye, captured in a raid on the Cork coast in the 1620s, who ended up in the household of a wealthy Algerian merchant. She converted, she married, she had children. She learned Arabic, she became completely integrated into Algerian society over the course of 20 years. And then a redemption mission arrived, and her brother was part of it, and he found her, and he offered to pay for her release. And she refused. She said she did not want to come home. She had a home. Her children were here. Her husband was here. Her life was here. Her brother, by all accounts, was devastated. She, by the same accounts, was calm and certain. I'm not going to tell you what the right response to that story is. I'm just going to tell you that it is true as far as we can verify it, and that it refuses to fit neatly into any of the simple narratives about Barbary captivity that people tried to tell at the time or since. For all the drama and the individual stories, the Barbary Corsair enterprise did eventually end. And the ending, when it came, was not the result of the sustained European naval campaigns that had been attempted for centuries. It came from two directions that combined to make the enterprise no longer viable: changing technology and a decisive French military intervention that reframed the whole problem. Let's start with technology. The development of more powerful and more accurate naval gunnery in the late 18th and early 19th centuries dramatically changed the balance between Corsair vessels and warships. The whole Corsair operational model depended on speed and evasion, getting in fast, taking what they could, getting out before a superior force could engage. As sailing ships became faster and naval guns became more accurate over longer ranges, the window for that kind of operation narrowed. A Corsair vessel that could once outrun a warship could no longer do so reliably, and a Corsair vessel that could once slip away in shallow water could now be hit from a distance before it reached safety. The American naval actions of 1801 to 1805 and 1815 demonstrated this shift clearly. American naval gunnery was sufficiently accurate and powerful to engage Corsair vessels at ranges where the Corsairs couldn't respond effectively. The British naval bombardment of Algiers in 1816 under Admiral Lord Exmouth, in retaliation for the continued holding of European captives, caused enormous damage to the harbor and the Corsair fleet in a single operation. The Algerians repaired the damage and continued operating, but the bombardment demonstrated that the technological advantage had shifted. Algiers was now vulnerable to a sustained naval campaign in a way it had not been a century earlier. The economics also shifted. The great European maritime powers of the early 19th century, Britain and France in particular, had navies that were far larger and more powerful than anything the Barbary states could field. The treaty and tribute approach had always been a rational calculation. It was cheaper to pay than to fight. By the early 19th century, that calculation was changing. The relative cost of a decisive military campaign was falling as European naval power grew. Simultaneously, the economic damage caused by continued Corsair activity was becoming increasingly unacceptable to the commercial and industrial economies that were developing in Western Europe. The decisive end came from France. In 1827, a diplomatic incident between France and the Dey of Algiers, the ruling authority, struck the French consul with a fly whisk during a heated argument, which sounds almost comical, but was in context a serious insult to French national honor, gave France a pretext to act. 3 years of preparations followed, and in June 1830, a French military expedition of 37,000 soldiers landed on the Algerian coast. Algiers fell in 3 weeks. The Dey surrendered. The Corsair enterprise, which had operated continuously for 300 years, was over. France did not liberate Algiers and leave. France colonized Algeria. The country would remain under French control for 132 years until Algerian independence in 1962. The ending of the Barbary Corsair era came at the price of the beginning of European colonialism in North Africa, which is one of history's more complicated exchanges. The elimination of piracy as the justification for military intervention, the transformation of that intervention into colonial occupation, and the century of French rule that followed, these are not separate stories. They are the same story. And understanding that connection changes how you see both the Corsair era and the colonial era that replaced it. For the populations of Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli, the end of the Corsair enterprise did not mean liberation. It meant a different kind of domination. The European powers that had been paying tribute to North African states for 3 centuries came back with armies, planted their flags, and stayed for over 100 years. The Corsairs had operated at the edge of power for 3 centuries. At the moment when the technological balance shifted decisively against them, the power that had been circling all along moved in, and the era ended not with the Corsairs being defeated at sea, but with an army landing on their beach. So why don't you know this story? You knew about Blackbeard, you knew about the golden age of Caribbean piracy, most of you probably knew something about Vikings, but the Barbary Corsairs, who operated for 3 times as long as the Caribbean pirates, who enslaved 10 times as many people, who directly shaped the early foreign policy of the United States, who terrorized a coastline stretching from Iceland to the Canary Islands, somehow didn't make it into the curriculum. Why? Part of the answer is genuinely straightforward. The Barbary Corsairs story does not fit neatly into the dominant narratives that Western history tends to organize itself around. It is not a story of Western European expansion and triumph. It is a story of Western European failure and vulnerability. For 300 years, the most powerful states in the world could not protect their own coastal populations from raiders operating out of North Africa. That is not a narrative that European historians have historically been enthusiastic about emphasizing. The Caribbean piracy narrative, by contrast, fits much more comfortably into the existing story. Caribbean pirates were operating at the edges of European colonial expansion. They were dramatic characters in a drama that was fundamentally about European power projecting itself across the Atlantic. Blackbeard and Calico Jack and Anne Bonny are colorful figures in a story that Europe tells about itself. The age of exploration, the building of empires, the conquest of the New World. The Barbary Corsairs are figures in a story about Europeans being conquered, about European coastal populations being taken as slaves, about European governments paying tribute to non-European powers to stop being raided. That story is harder to tell and harder to celebrate and harder to fit into the self-image that European civilization has constructed about this period. There is also the question of where the story ends. The Caribbean piracy story ends at a reasonably comfortable place. The Golden Age ended, the pirates were suppressed, order was restored, the colonial project continued. The ending is tidier than the middle. The Barbary Corsairs story ends in French colonialism, and French colonialism in Algeria was not a comfortable subject for a long time. The Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962 was one of the most brutal decolonization conflicts of the 20th century, and its wounds have not fully healed. Discussing the Barbary Corsairs in depth requires discussing the French invasion that ended them, which requires discussing French colonialism, which opens a set of conversations that many people have preferred to avoid. And then there is the uncomfortable symmetry that the story presents. Europeans enslaved Africans. We know this. We teach this. We grapple with it. Africans enslaved Europeans. We know this much less. We teach it much less. We grapple with it almost not at all. The history of slavery is more complicated than the dominant narrative allows for. It happened in more directions and between more groups than is comfortable to acknowledge. The Barbary Corsairs are one of the most vivid demonstrations of that complexity, and one of the most obvious reasons why the full history has been difficult to tell. None of this changes what happened. 1 million people were taken from their homes and their lives and their families and enslaved. That happened. The specific people, the 107 from Baltimore, the 400 from Iceland, the hundreds from the Cornish coast, the thousands from Italian and Spanish and French coastal villages were real. Their suffering was real. The industry that captured and sold and held them was real and sophisticated and operated for 300 years. It deserves to be known, not because it fits neatly into any narrative, but because it happened. And the best reason to know history is not because it is comfortable or because it confirms what you already believed. It is because it happened. All of it. The parts that fit and the parts that don't. That's the whole point. And that is the story of the Barbary Pirates. 300 years, 1 million captives, the world's first American overseas war, and somehow, barely anyone knows. If you made it to the end of this one, drop this in the comments. It is a real quote from one of the Algerian captains captured during the American Barbary Wars, when an American officer asked him why he had continued raiding after the treaty was signed. He said simply, "It is what we do."
Just that. Leave it down there. Subscribe and hit the bell if you want more history that doesn't make it into the textbooks, the real stories, the ones that change how you see the world you live in. And share this one if you know someone who thinks they know everything about pirates. Trust me, they don't. I'll see you in the next one.